there to turn it on. They've got to set the slides up, though. I don't know if I control this. Oh, we're way ahead of ourselves. Oh, I would like to thank Jean-Pierre for inviting me to this wonderful conference in this beautiful city, BIARRITZ. Welcome. Today I'm going to be talking to you about HIV incidence among people who inject drugs in Ukraine. This is the results of a peer-based intervention developed by Carl Latkin from Johns Hopkins. The background, as you may well know, there's a high prevalence of HIV among people who inject drugs in Ukraine. They typically engage in very high-risk behaviors, which are atypical of the behaviors that U.S. people who inject drugs engage in, such as sharing the drug solution, sharing drug preparation equipment. PWID in Ukraine are highly stigmatized and marginalized. However, it is not difficult to recruit them for this type of research using indigenous outreach workers. The locations where this particular project took place include Odessa, Nikolaev, and Donetsk. Unfortunately, the project in Donetsk is no longer in existence, in part well due to the separatists and the Russian troops that took over. Methods. We recruited over 2,300 injection drug users in Odessa, Nikolaev, and Donetsk for a randomized clinical trial comparing two interventions in reducing HIV incidence and HIV-related risk behaviors. In order to be included in the study, one had to be 16 years of age or older, self-reported drug injection in the last 30 days, verified by inspection for track marks and urinalysis, and willing to be interviewed for approximately 1 hour and tested for HIV. So individuals were required to be tested for HIV. They were not required to get their test results. In fact, more than 95% elected to get their test results because they had not previously been tested. We recruited in using the peer-based intervention model, 768 index or peer leaders, and twice that number of network members, or 1,536. In this particular presentation, I'm only focusing on those who are HIV negative at baseline because we're looking at incidence over time. Participants were followed longitudinally and interviewed and tested for HIV at baseline, 6, and 12 months. Index participants were recruited by recovering drug users or indigenous outreach workers at the 3 NGOs. In order to be eligible, in addition to the other eligibility requirements I just went over, they had to recruit 2 members of their injecting network who also had to be eligible. The control intervention was the updated version of the counseling and education intervention developed by the Cooperative Agreement in the early 1990s in the U.S. This was modified based upon the risk behaviors of the drug injectors in Ukraine. In this particular intervention, participants were counseled regarding reducing HIV risk behaviors and tested for HIV. As I indicated, slight modifications were necessary due to the injection practices of injecting drug users in Ukraine, such as injecting with a preloaded syringe and using drugs from a common container. The additional intervention, so everyone received the counseling and testing intervention. Half of the cohort was randomly assigned to a social network intervention based upon social learning, social identity, social norms, and social diffusion. This consisted of 5 sessions over a 3-week period with the indexes, over a 2-week period with the indexes. So to kind of give you a brief overview, the only individuals who actually received the enhanced intervention or the peer intervention were indexes in the experimental conditions. Their network members received no intervention. The idea was that the indexes would pass along harm reduction messages to their network members to look at diffusion of the intervention. Those in the control or comparison conditions, they received HIV testing and counseling only. The goal was to train peer leaders to educate network members in reducing their HIV-related risk behaviors. Analytical methods included the following. We calculated HIV incidence density overall and between the 2 interventions, utilized Cox proportional hazard regression with a generalized estimating equation, or G, extension, and we followed that with a longitudinal analysis of HIV risk behaviors using nested linear and generalized linear models. The results, of the total cohort, 1,200 were HIV negative at baseline, And of this, we successfully followed over 90%, or 1,085 people at 12 months. They averaged 32 years of age. They were on average 20 years of age when they began injecting, so they've been injecting for close to 10 years at the time we saw them. This sample was fairly equally distributed between the three sites, about a third in Odessa, a third in Nikolaev, and shortly less than a third in Donetsk. At baseline, there were no differences between the participants in the three cities or between the two cohorts, the experimental and comparison condition. Looking at incidence density, by the 12-month follow-up, there were 260 HIV seroconversion events among 1,000 and nearly 1,050 person years. Overall HIV incidence was 24.8 events per 100 person years. However, when we look at the two conditions, in the counseling and education or HIV testing only arm, the incidence was nearly 32 events per 100 person years. When we look at that, the C&E intervention plus the peer-based intervention, incidence was 18.4 years per 100 years, almost half. This graphically shows this change between, or the differences between the two intervention groups. The intervention group, the peer intervention, is in the blue at the top, and the control, those who received only testing and counseling, are in the bottom in the red. Looking at a univariate hazards ratios, the C&E intervention plus peer was highly significant and protective with a HR of 0.58. Years injecting, age, and past 30-day injection frequency were not protective. In other words, those people who had injected longer, those people who were older, and those people who injected more frequently were more likely to seroconvert. Having more than one sexual partner in the last 30 days was protective. And that's something that we found repeatedly in our work in Ukraine, and that those people who are HIV positive are less likely to have sex than those people who are HIV negative. We also found a difference on site. Those people in Nikolaev were less likely to seroconvert than those in Donetsk. Turning to a multivariate Cox proportional hazards, most of these variables retained their significance. Again, the enhanced intervention was protective. Again, age and past 30-day injection was not protective. Those people who were older and injected more frequently were more likely to be infected. Having more than one sexual partner remained protective, and here an additional city came into the model, Odessa versus Donetsk. So in both cases, Donetsk we have people who are more likely to seroconvert. Looking at secondary analytical outcomes, we were very curious about this effect. I mean, there aren't many or any that I know of behavioral interventions that have been found to reduce HIV incidence. In fact, we were astounded, to be honest with you. And so we did all kinds of additional analysis, looking at, well, maybe those in the enhanced intervention, reduced their needle sharing, or they reduced their sharing of drugs from a common container, or they changed their sex risk behaviors more. None of these were significant between the two groups. We looked at communication because we had a separate measure asking the indexes, how much did they communicate with their network members about harm reduction? And we asked the same questions of the network members in both conditions. How much did the index individual talk to you about reducing your injection or sex risk behaviors? Again, no significant differences. So I emailed the three NGOs and said, we're not sure what's going on with this. Can you tell me, are there any differences between those who received the peer-based intervention versus those who received testing and counseling only? And all three of the NGOs said, well, those who were in the peer-based intervention used our needle exchange more often. All three NGOs had a needle exchange attached to their program, but we did not emphasize that as part of the peer intervention. We mentioned it, of course. And we found that those in the enhanced intervention utilized the needle exchange much more often, and they also made themselves available of condoms at the NGOs more often than those who received testing and counseling. And so as this shows, at the 6-month interview, those in the peer intervention arm reported 53.2% more frequent use of needle exchange programs than those receiving testing and counseling only. At the 12-month interview, the peer intervention participants also had a more significant use of needle exchange programs than those in the testing and counseling arm only. And there's also some indication of sex risk reduction. At 12 months, those in the experimental condition versus the control condition, it was partially 0.02 level. But by sexual risk reduction, we mean more frequent use of condoms. In conclusion, there's a very high incidence in the cohort, 25 per person years overall. We found a 42% reduction in incidence in the pure lead arm. However, incidence was still quite high at 18.4 person years. Increased utilization of needle exchange programs in the pure lead intervention likely drove the reduction in HIV incidence. And I would like to thank those who participated in this study, in particular the directors of the NGOs, Olga Kosta and Tatiana in Odessa, Elena in Nikolaev, and Dmitry in Donetsk, and the participants who gave their time and willingness to participate in this study. And of course, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, who funded this project. Thank you.